Hi everybody, Mr. Poser here, your human anatomy and physiology teacher. Today we are continuing our second unit on the introduction to the human body in our class, Human Anatomy and Physiology, by studying the body planes today, as well as the directional terms associated with those three body planes. So, in this video we will discuss the three body planes, as you can see on the screen in front of you, and discuss the directional terms that come along with those body planes. And these are just different ways of organizing and figuring out directions in our body, because up, down, back, right, left don't really work as far as directions go in the human body, because that could change. So let's discuss the three bodily planes. And since we are three-dimensional, there are three planes, geometric planes, that we can study the body from. The first one is called the transverse, or also known as the horizontal plane, which divides the body into top and bottom. All right, so since we are three-dimensional, we have three different planes that can be studied. So the transverse plane, if you see me right here, this is like flat or horizontal here, and it divides the body into top and bottom. So if I'm looking at structures from this viewpoint, from above or from below, I am studying structures from the transverse plane. Okay, so above or below, that is the transverse plane. The mid-sagittal or the median plane divides the body into an equal right and equal left side. So here it is. It kind of looks like this. If you were to divide my body into the right and left side like so, this is studying the mid-sagittal plane. So I can view things from this angle or from this angle if I am viewing it with the sagittal or mid-sagittal plane. With that being said, the mid-sagittal plane divides it into equal left and right, but if I were to shift the plane either to the right or to the left, that would be known as not the mid-sagittal plane, but just the sagittal plane. But it still divides the body into the right and left sides. All right? And then finally, if you divide my body into a front and back side, that is called the frontal or the coronal plane. All right, so if I'm viewing structures from this viewpoint or from that viewpoint, that is studying structures with respect to the frontal or coronal plane. Just a review back to body cavities here, you should have already had this diagram here. This diagram over here is studying the body's cavities from the mid-sagittal plane, so viewing it from either the right or left side. You split it down the middle like so. But this diagram over here is viewing the body cavities from the frontal plane, from the front or from the back. All right, so we are a little familiar with these, but here's another picture showing each of the planes. Here's the transverse plane, once again dividing the body into top and right, or as we're about to find out, into superior and inferior. Here's the frontal plane, dividing the body into front and back, or also called anterior and posterior. And then finally the sagittal, or if it's right in the middle, it's called the mid-sagittal plane, dividing the body into left and right, or lateral and medial. All right, we're going to talk about what those words are in just a minute. So we use different directional terms when we're referring to things in the human body other than left, right, down, up, below, above, that kind of thing, because the human body is a little complex and we need to be more specific. And depending on the severity of some kind of problem within the human body, you can't just say like, oh no, a doctor can't just be like, oh, their tummy hurts. Like, okay, or like you swallow something and it's like, oh, it's in your tummy somewhere. That's not specific at all. And you need to be very, very particular about where locations are within the human body, if that's going to be something that you're going to get into. But yeah, we're going to get into it in this class. So we're going to talk about directional terms here. So we have two directional terms with respect to the transverse plane. The first one would be superior towards the head or the upper body. So it's going this way. An example of using superior in a sentence would be that my head is superior to my shoulders. It's kind of like above my shoulders. But again, we're going to stop using those words like above, below, right, left, because we're going to start using these directional terms. So my head is superior to my shoulders, and my shoulders are superior to my legs, something like that. The opposite of superior is inferior, or away from the head or towards the lower body. So this way, right? So I can also say that my shoulders are inferior to my head, or my legs are inferior to my shoulders. Okay? So that's with respect to the transverse plane. The transverse plane divides us into superior and inferior. Okay? Moving on, the median or mid-sagittal plane, with the directional terms that we get from that are medial and lateral. Medial is towards the midline or the middle of the body. Okay, so medial refers to this way. This bone right here, it's called your sternum or your breastbone. It's the most medial bone in your thoracic cavity. So I can say my sternum is medial to my pectoral muscles. I could say my sternum is, let's just use the shoulders again. It's medial to my shoulders. It's more towards the midline. All right, so let's see, what's another one? My nose is medial to my ears and my eyes, okay, so it's more towards the midline. The opposite of medial is lateral, away from the midline, so I could also say my ears are lateral to my nose. My shoulders are lateral to my sternum. Make sense? I hope it does. So that's lateral and medial, and those are terms with respect to the mid-sagittal plane, right? So if it's closer to the mid-sagittal plane, it's medial. If it's further away, it's what we call lateral. All right, let's keep moving here. As far as the frontal plane, the directional terms that are associated with the frontal plane are anterior, also known as ventral, and posterior, also known as dorsal. So anterior means towards the front of the body, your belly, right? So we talked about those in our body cavities video last time. And yeah, posterior means towards the back or the behind, right? So I could say as an example that my sternum, let's just use that again, my sternum or breastbone is anterior to my vertebral column, okay? It's more towards the front, and my my vertebral column is more towards the back. I could say that my nose is anterior to my ears, okay? It's more towards the front than my ears are. So posterior, I could say my ears are posterior to my nose. It's the opposite, right? They're further back. With respect to the frontal plane, they're further back than my nose. I could also say my vertebral column is posterior to my sternum, something like that, so to show that it is behind. Let's see, what's another good example? I could say my belly button is anterior to my tailbone. Something like that. Okay, so those are terms with respect to the frontal plane. Now, there's two more sets of directional terms that are going to be important for us to know, but they have less to do with the planes themselves. Let me see if I can make this smaller. There we go. And those two terms, I'm going to move my face here, are proximal and distal. Proximal is defined as close to the origin of a body part or the point of attachment of a limb to the body trunk. Now, what the heck does that mean? Let's talk about it in a second here. So, here's a limb. You have 4 limbs. Your 2 arms and 2 legs, presumably. I don't want to assume, but you know, most people have 2 limbs, or excuse me, 2 arms, 2 legs, right? So here's a limb. We use the terms proximal and distal only with respect to limbs. Okay, so we're not dealing with planes here. All right, so I have structures on my limbs. I have my fingers, I have my thumb, I have my wrist, I have my elbow, I have my shoulder. Okay, so if I want to use the word proximal, I could describe my elbow as being more proximal than my wrist, simply because the proximal means it's closer to the origin of the body part, or closer to the point of attachment, which is my shoulder, right? This is the point of attachment to my trunk. So my elbow is proximal to my wrist. My shoulder is proximal to my elbow. Okay, I can use those. You can do that for your legs. Like you could say your knee is proximal to your ankle, something like that. And the opposite of proximal is distal, farther from the origin of the body part or the point of attachment of a limb to the body trunk. Okay, so I could say my fingers are distal to my wrist. My wrist is distal to my elbow. Okay, but my elbow is proximal to my wrist. All right, so those two terms are opposites. Distal is further away from the point of attachment, so your fingertips are the most distal part of your arm, okay? But the proximal is towards the point of attachment, so the shoulder is the most proximal part of my arm here. Okay, so proximal and distal, those are going to be 2 terms to remember, and our last 2 that we're going to discuss are superficial and deep. Superficial means towards or at the body surface. Deep means away from the body surface, more internal. and this one's kind of hard to show an example of, but so if it's more towards the surface, it's more superficial, and if it's less towards the surface, it's more deep. So the most superficial component of your skin, for example, it's called your epidermis. Okay, you see my epidermis right now. There's a joke in The Simpsons. It's like, your epidermis is showing. Yeah, that's because it is. So this is the most superficial components of the skin. Okay, underneath the epidermis, we're going to talk about this in our integumentary system unit. Underneath the epidermis is what we call the dermis, and that's deep to the epidermis. I could also say, if that's just if I'm talking about my skin relative to my muscles, say like in my arm here, my skin is superficial to the muscles, and my muscles are superficial to the bone. Okay. Or I could also use the term deep. I could say my bones are deep to the muscles, and I could say my muscles are deep to my skin. Okay? So superficial, more towards the surface. Deep is away from the surface. And I believe that's going to be it for this video. We're going to be using those directional terms a lot, and for the rest of the year when we're referring to stuff within the human body. Anything having to do with anatomy, we're going to be using these terms. So forget above, below, up, down, whatever. Okay, we're going to be using proximal, distal, superficial, deep, anterior, posterior, ventral, dorsal, lateral, medial, and what are the first ones? Oh, superior, inferior. Okay, sounds good. Let me know if you have any questions. Bye.